After months of military confrontation, a crippling naval blockade, and rising regional tensions, Washington and Tehran appear to be on the verge of a historic yet fragile breakthrough. Brokered by Pakistan, the Memorandum of Understanding is expected to be formally signed in Geneva this Friday, bringing an end to a conflict that threatened to destabilize the entire Middle East. The agreement promises a halt to military operations, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports, and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Yet, competing narratives persist. Washington presents the deal as a diplomatic success, while Tehran portrays it as a strategic victory that preserves its core interests and influence. At the same time, major questions remain unanswered. Deep divisions have emerged within the American political establishment over the costs and objectives of the war. Across the global south, critics argue the conflict has exposed Western double standards on international law and diplomacy. Adding further uncertainty, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly challenged key provisions of the agreement regarding Lebanon, raising concerns that the ceasefire could face serious obstacles before it is fully implemented. Is this the beginning of a new regional order or merely a temporary pause before another round of confrontation? These questions and more are put to my panel on All 24 News Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special coverage on All 24 News with me, Kirin Fazakari. And before we begin the discussion, here is a report.
Against the serene backdrop of Switzerland's Birkenstock resort, a war that ravaged the Middle East for more than 3 months is set to come to an official end. On Friday, the United States and Iran will gather for the signing of an initial deal that focuses on ending the war and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed both the date and the location of the signing ceremony, saying the Memorandum of Understanding will usher in a 60-day negotiating process aimed at securing a final deal. The talks are expected to focus on the most contentious issues, including Iran's nuclear program and the lifting of economic sanctions.
In the
first phase, we will negotiate issues related to ending the war, the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime blockade, the release of Iran's frozen funds, reconstruction, and other matters connected to these topics. The aim was to reach a memorandum of understanding on these issues, and then negotiations to continue for 60 days in order to achieve a final agreement where decisions will be made on nuclear-related issues and the lifting of sanctions.
Yet major points of contention remain, as Iran maintains that any peace agreement with Washington must encompass Lebanon and include the withdrawal of the Zionist forces from the country's south. Accordingly, Tehran says any attack on Lebanon would constitute a breach of the agreement.
The end of the war also includes the end of occupation without the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the territories they have occupied in this war. A full end to the war has not been achieved, and any military attack by the Zionist regime on Lebanon from now on, as well as the continued occupation of Lebanese territories from now on, will, in our view, be considered a violation of the Memorandum of Understanding.
Trump, on the other hand, says he considers the war in Lebanon a minor one, highlighting the possible divisions that negotiators will still have to overcome.
Mr. President, what are the expectations for Israel? Can this deal survive if Israel attacks Lebanon?
It can, and I consider that the minor war, the Iran's a big one.
The deal, described by Trump as good and fair, is expected to be signed by Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, and US Vice President J.D. Vance, setting the stage for a new diplomatic chapter, with the facts extending well beyond the Middle East into global markets.
And to help us unpack the diplomatic, strategic, and economic fallout of this historic turning point, I am joined tonight by a distinguished panel of experts. From Washington, D.C. is Greg Priddy, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Center for the National Interest. Good to see you, Priddy. Joining us from Glasgow is Dr. Yvonne Ridley, leader of the Scotland Workers' Party, former journalist and renowned British author. Yvonne, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And from Vienna, we're joined by Mr. Benjamin Ashraf, analyst at the Open Nuclear Network. Thank you for finding some time for us, Benjamin.
Thank you, Kareem. Thank you for having me.
And in New York is Mr. Mohammed Krisansi, geopolitical observer and financial analyst. Hello there, Mr. Mohammed Krisansi. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, always a pleasure to be with you. And as usual, when Yvonne is here, I'm happy.
Thank you. And Mr. Greg Pretty, senior fellow at the Middle East Center for National Interest. Are you with me?
Yes, I'm with you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us.
You're welcome.
All right, let's begin with you, Mr. Greg Pretty. Washington is framing the Islamabad memorandum as a breakthrough, yet there is growing pushback from the American establishment. The critiques are arguing that the U.S. has waged a costly and winnable war that served Israel's regional ambitions far more than America's own national interest, that is. So has the U.S. effectively squandered its strategic capital for an ally that openly defies the agreement's terms on Lebanon?
Well, I would say, there are deep divisions within, even the political establishment in Washington, even within President Trump's Republican Party. There are certainly, people even in the Republican Party who see this as having been a mistake, and most Democrats see it as having been a mistake, and as something that, we have to find a way out of, even though there isn't a good way out. So, I think even President Trump, some of his tone recently seems to have realized that we got ourselves into something where there was no good outcome to be had. Israel obviously is not happy with there was an agreement. They would have preferred to keep it going longer. They would have preferred to, the regime change failed, which was the original objective. But when that didn't happen, Israel would have preferred to keep doing additional damage to Iran's infrastructure so that they would take longer to bounce back from the war and recover economically and rearm from the Israeli standpoint. But the U.S. had to find a way out. There simply was no good way out. I think on Lebanon, we don't know precisely what the wording is in there regarding Lebanon. And, I think it's probably pretty vague because Iran is making one set of assertions based on international law. And I don't think the Trump administration intended to force Israel to withdraw from Lebanese territory. I do think they intended to lean on Israel to accept a ceasefire in place, but we don't know precisely what the wording is on that. And so there's still, a lot of question mark here over whether the agreement will hold.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think that if the escalations in Lebanon continue, this is going to damage the peace deal?
That's like I just said, I'm not sure that it will stay in place. There definitely is a risk. But I think that, President Trump's tone when he spoke today about it and the way he termed Netanyahu as essentially being irresponsible from Trump's point of view, he is leaning pretty hard on Netanyahu. Again, I think the U.S. is going to lean on Israel to accept a ceasefire in place, not to withdraw.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. All right, let me bring in now Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Yvonne, as a political leader yourself and former journalist, having closely observed Western narratives crumbling, this ceasefire was brokered by Islamabad, not London, not Paris, nor Washington. And so what does this shifting diplomatic center of gravity tell us about the Global South rejection of Western hegemony and the declining credibility of the U.S. and Western capitals as international peace brokers?
Well, the US and UK got benched while Islamabad quietly secured the actual deal. As for the Global South rising, developing nations are really tired of Western lectures. and are now writing their own rules. On top of that, the bromance between Netanyahu and Trump seems to be breaking up. The spectacular fallout between the two shows the West can't even coordinate within its own inner circle. So there is a credibility issue here, and decades of rules-based order rhetoric have officially run out of gas. And so, welcome to the new world order where Uncle Sam and Downing Street are sitting at the kids' table. For decades, Western capitals acted like they owned the patent on world peace, usually delivering it via heavy-handed sanctions or a few thousand troops. Now the diplomatic centre of gravity has packed its bags and moved on, watching Islamabad broker a major ceasefire while Western diplomats were busy drafting strongly worded tweets is the ultimate reality check. The global South isn't just rejecting Western hegemony, they are actively changing the channel. Turns out the rest of the world is perfectly capable of talking to each other without a patronizing Anglo-American translator. So for decades, Washington and London ran international diplomacy like it was their own exclusive VIP club, acting as though they owned the patent on world peace. And their favourite strategy seemed to be show up late, lecture everyone on the values, and hand out heavy-handed sanctions. But as we see, there's a different story unfolding today.
Nice. Mr. Benjamin Ashraf, the Geneva signing defers the nuclear question for a 60-day window. The international community, however, frequently condemns the West's intense focus on Iran's nuclear latency while turning a blind eye to Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal. How is this glaring hypocrisy impacting the actual legitimacy of global non-proliferation norms? I mean, what does Israel have as a right that Iran doesn't? Should Iran has some kind of bromance, like Dr. Yvonne Ridley actually labeled it, with Iran?
Yeah, as Dr. Ridley said, I think there's a bit of an elephant in the room, and I think this idea of turning a blind eye or double standards really goes for many people as to whether this non-proliferation regime is considered as legitimate. I guess let's circle back for a little bit, but Iran has signed the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, and through deals like the JCPOA has accepted some of the most intrusive verification methods that any country of that status has applied to. There's also the religious element, of course, of Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa against nuclear weapons as a political red line. Now, by contrast, Israel never joined the NPT. It hasn't accepted those same legal obligations, and as we all know, it maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, although most experts agree that amounts to 90 nuclear weapons. So what you end up with is you have one regional state which is under constant inspection, sanction pressure, and another nuclear armed state which is sitting completely outside of this treaty framework. And so, as Dr. Ridley was saying, for many governments that doesn't really look like a rules-based system. Instead, it looks more like a hierarchy where one's allies are accommodated and the adversaries are disciplined. I would just like to say that I think that, like with the last 3 years, Gaza has been the main story, really, and that has sharpened the perception of analysts like us. So humanitarian law and accountability, they're enforced far more aggressively for certain actors than other close Western partners. And so that inevitably spills for someone like me working in nuclear risk into the nuclear file. So if the broader legal order looks selective, then it's hard to convince somebody that non-proliferation is somehow immune from that same politics. So to sum up, when people ask what right does Israel have that Iran can't, I mean, the blunt answer really is there is no special legal right in the treaty text. The difference is political. Iran bound itself to a bargain. Israel stayed outside of it, and the system has learned to live with that. But as Dr. Ridley said, and as you said, Kareem, the more that the system doubles down on its double standards, the more fragile that system and that regime becomes. And I think that's the world that we're living in today.
Amazing. And now, Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, let's just look at the economic aspect here. President Donald Trump declared, let the oil flow as the U.S. lifts its naval blockade. But the deal concedes that Iran will retain control of the Strait of Hormuz and even charge transit fees. Now, my question goes like this. Is this a tacit admission that the U.S. military can no longer dictate terms at global energy choke points? And what is the real economic fallout we are really witnessing here?
Well, the proposition that Mr. Trump is saying, that constitutes an agreement, that tacit admission that the United States has, my dear colleague Yvonne was saying, they can no longer dictate the outcome at the military strategy, neither at the economical strategy. But the episode demonstrates the increasing cost of coercive control of an area of economic interdependence. And historically, to answer about the US maritime power, they still have the ability to control in a certain way the navigation through the critical sea line of the Detroit of Hormuz. From the Persian Gulf to the South Sea of China, the navigation, the maritime US navigation still have a kind of power. But the reported US-Iran agreement does not renegate the capability. Rather, it suggests that Washington concluded that the economical cost of sustaining the blockade and is a prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, it now economically has become greater than the strategic benefit derived from continued pressure on Iran. He didn't work. So now the agreement, therefore, to answer your question, reflect recalibrate the strategy rather than a collapse of all the military power and the importance of America. But from that perspective of international political economy, the more significant development is that Iran appears now to have emerged with a recognized role in the governance of the Strait, not only because the international water is 11 miles and you have also, they say you can add another 11 miles, but the full control that Tehran is requesting, I think, ultimately, it increases the influence of the transit arrangement, and maybe also they will be able to collect some maritime fees, which Trump said they will not. But I think Trump is wrong on that point, but that's my personal assessment. Now, when you go to the second economic fallout, and that we can also talk about it during the conflict, don't forget that approximately 1/5 of the global seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas flow were affected because of the Strait of Hormuz. Normally, carry about, if my numbers are good, is 20 million barrels a day. Now, the disruption generated a sharp increase in energy price, and we see that now they are talking about the deal that they want to sign. I can talk about that later, but today is from $117 the barrel. Today is $78 the barrel, the Brent, I'm talking about the Brent. So therefore, economically, we are trying to recover slowly, and Trump come to realize that, since it was affected not only America, but also all the Asia and the world trade as a whole, he become to his senses economically, and the business team around him tell him you have to stop that. But however, the financial market, yes, have reacted, as I said, to the announcement of the reopening of the Detroit of Hormuz, but we have to wait how it's going to finalize, because again and again, I have just a note. Trump today or 2 weeks ago, he was talking about the deal, the peace deal, and then he said it's going to be signed on Friday. Then he put it on Saturday, and then it's going to be done next Friday. In between, for me, it's not a ceasefire. Here they stop the bombing, but nothing of consistent accord are signed yet. And you have this 60 days coming. And with Trump, again and again, I always, the country risk is there. And with Trump,
Definitely.
I never know if he's
The
going to go
harm
through
is done, Mr. Mohammed Krisasi. Supply chains reacted, and a lot of countries actually felt the shock. And here, let me turn to Mr. Greg Pretty. Looking at the broader geopolitical chessboard, Mr. Pretty, how heavily is the U.S. establishment regretting this military entanglement, according to you? Has this confrontation simply bogged America down in the Middle East, allowing China, for example, to rapidly consolidate its diplomatic and economic influence without firing a single shot? I mean, before people used to speak about America and its soft power, especially those who were fascinated by its civilization and history. The founding fathers who built America upon a hill for everybody to follow, just like a role model. But now all this is evaporating with this administration.
I don't see this primarily through the lens of U.S.-China rivalry, and I'll come back to that. But I do think that most of the American establishment at this point realizes that this was a mistake. There are still some outliers, Iran hawks and neoconservatives, but I think most of the establishment, certainly the midpoint, realizes this was a mistake. There were a lot of people in Washington who just were in denial previously about Iran's ability to close the strait. Given that the U.S. has the strongest Navy in the world, and people just made some assumptions about that. Of course, the Navy could clean it up. We could escort tankers. None of that worked. That was not a surprise to me. I've spent much of my career thinking about this issue. I knew that they had relatively modern anti-ship missiles, and the naval mines and boats as well, but these modern anti-ship missiles are really what give them the capability that they need. But with that, they can strangle the global economy, and we can try to push back with a blockade, but we're also under severe economic pressure as well. And so I think much of Washington prior to this war, and certainly President Trump, just really underestimated how much power Iran had over the global economy. I think the U.S. has also done a lot of damage to our ties with Gulf Arab countries that we've had good relationships with in the past and have been a big part of their security strategy. I think that those could mend, with time. But right now, the Gulf Arabs have seen, there's an interesting pattern where the Gulf Arab countries, with the exception of the Emirates, Emirates has kind of leaned toward Israel, but all of the others, the U.S. had been trying to get Saudi Arabia and the others to normalize relations with Israel and to kind of enter into an entente with Israel to balance against Iran. That's been U.S. foreign policy for a long time. We never were able to get that done. Saudi Arabia didn't normalize or join the Abraham Accords. And in this war, the Saudis have wanted to hold back from it and not get involved, and have also played a big role in pushing for a solution, for this type of ceasefire, rather than being in Israel's corner and wanting to finish the job, as Israel puts it. So that divide between countries aligned with the U.S. otherwise is a weakness for us and a big problem that we've run into. Coming back to China, China already had influence in the Gulf. I think this makes, for some people, China looks like the adult in the room. They respect national sovereignty, they respect international law as everyone sees it, and the U.S. is the outlier. A lot of people in the region, even countries friendly to the U.S., will see it that way. China doesn't want to take over the American security role, but the Arabs don't really trust Washington to support their security to the extent that they used to, given what they've seen in the limitations on American capabilities in this war, and particularly with the Strait. The one thing where I think this does strengthen China relative to the US, though, is that the US has expended a lot of critical munitions. Our inventories of many types of missiles and high-end munitions are run down by half or more, and that weakens American defense posture, say, for Taiwan or in Asia, where we have a much depleted arsenal if anything happened with China over those things.
Lovely. Now, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, let's focus a little bit on Europe now. The continent was the one that bore actually the brunt of energy market shocks and the constant threat of regional spillover, while politically backing Israeli hardliners at the same time. So, given the clear double standards we see from Western capitals, is the European political class facing a crisis of legitimacy at home for blindly following U.S. military adventurism at the expense of their own citizens, that is?
I think the term that we could be looking for is moral bankruptcy, because the rules-based order has been exposed as a private club with double standards. And they have been ably assisted in the past by the Western media, and they're struggling now to put any sort of positive spin on what is happening in the Middle East. The Global South has permanently checked out of the West's selective moral lectures. And, to be completely honest, I think that the rules-based order, as was said earlier, is probably dead, buried and exposed as a total con. This isn't a new glitch in the system, it's the original design. For decades, Washington and Brussels have operated exactly like the old colonial empires, writing the law to shackle their rivals while giving themselves favourite clients a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. They did it during the Cold War, they did it in Iraq, and they are doing it right now. The only difference is that the Western media machine can no longer hide the bodies. The days of 3 TV networks filtering the news to keep Western consciences clean are long gone. We saw Gaza and the war crimes and the genocide unfold on our smartphones. Everything that is happening now is you can pick up your phone and get the news 24/7. And of course, channels like AL24 News are operating round the clock. So no amount of clever framing or soft headlines can really compete with the raw, brutal reality flashing directly into billions of smartphones. You cannot selectively weaponize human rights on Monday, look the other way on a Tuesday, and then expect the Global South to sit there quietly while they are getting a lecture on the Wednesday. The damage isn't just permanent, it's fatal. And the West has finally shredded its own mask, and the rest of the world is completely done with playing what essentially is a rigged game. And on top of that, the real comedy is watching the total meltdown behind the scenes. Look at the spectacular expletive-filled fallout between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump is publicly shouting that Netanyahu is bleep, bleep crazy, has no judgment, and would be in prison if the US hadn't saved his neck. Meanwhile, he's at the G7 right now saying that without me, there would be no Israel. So when the leader of the free world is reduced to airing his dirty laundry on social media because his closest ally won't stop sabotaging his peace plans, that the superpower era is cooked, as they say in America. So the Global South isn't just rejecting Western hegemony, they are watching it cannibalize itself. so these are incredible times for people like ourselves who are sitting watching the media 24/7 and are able to get information very quickly. And of course, it's not just us, it's ordinary people around the world as well, who are now, because they've been hit in the pocket, are wanting to know what is happening. Is there a ceasefire? Will it last? And all of these other relevant questions. And we're now waking up to a totally different new period in history.
Lovely. Thank you for all those sharp insights. Now, let me ask this question to you, Mr. Benjamin Ashraf. Since we're having all these different narratives, on the one hand, we see the U.S. trying to portray this deal as a victory or as a diplomatic successful deal. Tehran, on the other hand, is projecting this upcoming ceremony in Switzerland as a real victory, having survived not only a direct U.S.-Israeli military assault, but also it kept its uranium stockpiles intact, and at the same time nothing really happened to the regime. And another point is the fact that they will be discussing the unfreezing of their funds and assets. Now, did the maximalist military pressure, in light of this, the military pressure campaign actually ultimately fail? Did it fail, proving that regional deterrence cannot simply be bumped out of existence?
So I was monitoring the news on Friday when things started to change, and when Meha News released the 14-point plan, it did certainly seem like a victory, if that is what ends up transpiring. But let's be real for a second. I think Tehran clearly has a victory story to tell, but it is still a contested one. The US and Israel did inflict real damage on Iranian infrastructure and its leadership. And it goes without saying that the country remains economically and socially bruised even beforehand. But as you said, Kareem, at the same time, the war didn't achieve its, as you've described it, maximalist aims. Its 60% uranium stockpile remains in the country, its basic enrichment capabilities survived, and now that we seem to have an MOU on the table and a ceasefire framework kind of being organized, what's part of it is sanctions relief, the nuclear file, and the Strait of Hormuz and Lebanon. And so that's kind of the paradox. So Washington and Tel Aviv kind of hoped that they would break Iran's will, first initially through airstrikes, and then secondly with their plan for involving the Kurds. But what they instead find themselves dealing with is back at the negotiating table with a partner that, as the US intel today has said, has a de facto weapon stronger than a nuclear weapon in the Strait of Hormuz. It still can mobilize partners like Hezbollah, who are adapting in southern Lebanon, and it can still claim some level of domestic legitimacy by pointing to it weathering the attacks that it did. And so from that angle, to answer your question directly, the pressure campaign has exposed the limits of what trying to bomb a regional deterrent posture in submission actually does. It doesn't work, but it isn't a cost-free success. There's been deep mistrust now between Iran and its Gulf neighbors. It's hardened a feeling of Western threat perceptions, and it goes without saying that it's brought the region and perhaps the world to a wider war. So there is lessons on both ends. So for major powers like the United States and Israel and Russia in Syria, of course, airstrikes are no substitute for a political strategy. And for Iran, surviving doesn't erase the fact that its actual deterrent is now seen more threatening as ever, kind of paradoxically. And so the war itself has shown that deterrence can't simply be bombed out of existence. But it does make this standoff between the United States and Iran, I guess, more entrenched now and more volatile.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Now, let's get back to the economic aspect. And here, Dr. Mohammed Krissasi, the financial toll of blockading Iranian ports has been catastrophic for international trade, there is no doubt. And with China increasingly relying on alternative land and maritime routes, has this war inadvertently accelerated the de-dollarization of the energy market and handed perhaps Beijing the ultimate economic advantage? How would you read this, Mr. Mohammed Krissasi?
Well, as Yvonne was saying, the super club of world-scale civilization, economically and politically, is like a superpower to quote Yvonne. It's cooked when you have the double standard, when you have the mistrust, not only of Trump, but all the other acolytes that are with him right now, when you have a moral bankruptcy in the Western world, what do you expect? Of course, the causality is that the financial toll of this blockade in Iran has been catastrophic for the international trade. As you said, China now increasingly relying on an alternative land for the oil and also for new maritime route. And this war inadvertently accelerated the de-dollarization of the energy market and handling Beijing a golden plate, I should say, for the ultimate economic advantage. But we have to look at it now a little bit more rigorously. My assessment will suggest that the conflict has likely accelerated existing trend toward diversification in global trade and finance. And also, you have to consider, at least for myself as an economist and a banker for many years, it will be premature to conclude that it has fundamentally transformed the international monetary order or delivered China from an ambiguous economic victory, because they still have tied for this system. When you have all the bonds that they have in their possession, the bond du trésor, etc. So therefore, in international political economy, the major geopolitical crises often act as an accelerator rather than originator of structure change. Even though, and I agree with Yvonne, is a new world order now coming from China with the help of the global source, and don't forget also the BRICS. But the current conflict, to come back to that, the current conflict did not create the movement toward a de-dollarization. Rather, again and again is my humble opinion, he's intensified the tendency already visible over the past decade, which is the increasing use of sanction, financial restriction, maritime disruption, are encourage the state to reduce dependence on institutions and payment system perceived as vulnerable to geopolitical pressure. So therefore, the perspective is the blockade of Iranian port and the disruption of Gulf Strait route have reinforced incentive for major economy, particularly China. Why? Because China pursues the mechanism for the trade settlement, for the transportation, as I was saying, they find the new, and for the energy security. Now China, what is the China strategic position? We give it to them. They give it to them. Now China enters this crisis with an advantage that many other economic do not possess. Over the last decade, Beijing has systematically invested in a network of alternative corridors designed to reduce exposure to maritime checkpoints, such as the Strait of Hormuz and even the strait close to themselves to Malacca. So this includes again and again the power is they think about the cross-border energy. They have a pipeline now linking China to all Central Asia, even to China, to Russia, and they have the rail corridors, as you are talking many times on your show, connecting East Asia to Europe through Eurasia. Then, of course, consequently, when traditional maritime route experience disrupted, like the Gulf War that you are living right now, China is comparatively better positioned than many competitors to absorb the shock and redirect portion of its trade flow. Now, just a word for the de-dollarization, and I give you back the floor. The de-dollarization, of course, you have an acceleration, but not a transformation. The crucial question is whether this translates into meaningful de-dollarization. And my answer is The US dollar, I reiterate, continue to dominate. The global foreign exchange reserve continue to be in China, so therefore they're linked to it and they cannot go just overnight to change it.
Sure.
And you have, of course, the international trade invoicing. Which country doesn't do trade and the invoice is in dollar? And now, of course, this advantage, they are not merely political, but they derive from the deep liquidity, the credibility of the US financial market.
Thank you.
Monetary. So now I have to give you back the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Christensen. Thank you.
Go ahead.
It's pretty clear. Technically, you said it. It was visible from the very beginning, but then this kind of war and other conflicts are accelerating this. And you said a very important key word, the credibility. It's not just the credibility of the financial market, as you said, but also the credibility of the United States. And here I ask you, Mr. Greg Priddy, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly stated that Israel will not pull troops from Lebanon, despite the Friday agreement stipulating the end of military operations on all fronts. Now, how can Washington claim to enforce international law and stability when its closest ally actively sabotages the very peace deal the U.S. just signed? I mean, if this really escalates and he goes stubbornly, accelerating the situation there, so what would be the strategic exit for the United States then?
Well, we still, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know the precise wording of the MOU. The U.S. is clearly interpreting that as a ceasefire in place, and Iran is clearly interpreting that as a withdrawal. I think, basing that on the international law argument that the presence of foreign troops in Lebanon is itself an act of war, and they probably didn't word it very precisely, in part because you've got a couple of real estate investors rather than diplomats who are handling the negotiations for the U.S. So they really have gotten the professionals out of diplomacy and put in a couple of people who aren't terribly well qualified to be doing this in the first place. But the Trump administration clearly doesn't see this as requiring Israeli withdrawal. What I do see happening, though, is I think Trump is going to lean pretty hard on Netanyahu to try to get them to accept a ceasefire in place. And I think he's probably willing to expend a little bit of political capital to do that. But obviously most of the world doesn't see that as legitimate, in terms of international law. But I think it's the most important point here is that the U.S. Was definitely feeling the pressure from the Strait of Hormuz and from what would have been, probably an economic recession if we had not had this deal. And so, Trump does realize that if we went back to active conflict with Iran, that probably is going to have, a bad impact on the U.S. economy and on his party's chances for the midterm elections coming up in November. And so that is going to be important to them. I think he will try to rein in Israel to the extent that he can, but withdrawal to the international border is not something they see as part of the deal.
Mm-hmm. And now, if we come to look at the narratives, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, we have witnessed unprecedented condemnation from international audiences over the human cost of this war. And despite, Western media's attempts to soften, let's say, the narrative, how permanent is the damage to the so-called rules-based international order, according to you, when the US and Europe selectively apply human rights and international law, depending on whether the aggressor or the transgressor is a rival or friend?
Well, if we drop the diplomatic politeness, Britain and Europe aren't just losing their grip on the Middle East. They've completely been locked out of the building. For centuries, London and Paris drew the borders, Washington supplied the arms and the weapons, and Western capitals treated the entire world like their personal backyard. Those days are now long gone, and they are never going to come back. Pakistan's mediation isn't just a one-off diplomatic fluke. It's serving as a wake-up call. The political heavyweights of the region have looked at the smoking ruins of NATO and Western interventionism in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and they've made a collective decision. Never again. They are bypassing Washington, ignoring Whitehall, and completely cutting out the Western middlemen.
So is this, are we really witnessing a permanent birth of a new multipolar architecture in the Middle East, where regional powers are bypassing Washington and other Western capitals? Is that it?
Yes, that's entirely it. I couldn't have said it better. You know, European leaders are stuck in endless, toothless committee meetings in Brussels, and the rest of the world has moved on. The new architecture is built, the concrete is dry, and I'm afraid the West doesn't have a visitor's pass. And, you know, let's also be clear, countries like Algeria is sitting pretty in an absolute gold-plated position right now. Algiers is holding all the economic cards, watching the old colonial masters crawl back on their knees, begging for natural gas. The West doesn't dictate terms to North Africa anymore. North Africa is setting the price. It is the ultimate dawn of a new era, and the timing couldn't be more poetic. While the West is completely falling apart at the seams politically, Algeria is busy showing up on the biggest stage on the planet. Tomorrow, it will be tomorrow with about just over 3 hours to go. The Desert Foxes are stepping out of their highly anticipated World Cup opener against none other than the reigning world champions, Argentina. It's a perfect metaphor for the global shifting order, and the global south isn't hiding in the shadows anymore. They are stepping right into the stadium, ready to take on the heavyweights, look them dead in the eye, and play the game on their own terms. I'm a football fan. I had to get that one in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Now let's move to you, Benjamin Ashraf. If we look ahead to the technical talks, Washington expects Iran to make nuclear concessions, but given the history of the US unilaterally abandoning past agreements, why should Tehran now, or the international community for that matter, trust any American signature in Geneva without concrete, ironclad guarantees, that is?
I think, Kareem, there's an argument to be said that I don't think the US itself knows what position it has. I mean, it started off by talking about that it was going to physically remove this 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. Then a few weeks later, it decided that it was going to downgrade that uranium. And then today, speaking next to the Qatari Prime Minister in Davos, Donald Trump said you could make the case that it's not very valuable at all. And so all of those things combine together to suggest that the US itself doesn't really know what it's saying. And so if you imagine yourself as an Iranian negotiator or indeed a Gulf state watching from the sidelines, it's a combination of, do we trust Washington's word, but do they even have a proper view about what they're asking for? And so I think if there is to be any kind of concrete solution to this, it's not going to be based purely on Washington. It's going to need to be a regional issue. And it's going to need a wider framework, whether that includes Europe, like the JCPOA, or more likely key regional players like the Gulf states, but crucially clear snapback provisions if either side cheats. So I think that Iran, but also I would say, Kareem, that the nuclear issue actually, as the conflict has gone on, has become less of a big thing. It was actually the Strait of Hormuz that I think is Trump's main consideration. And Iran knows that, and it will see the nuclear steps and the nuclear deal and want it to be linked to physical steps or visible steps on the ground. So things like de-escalation south of Lebanon, and also rules of the road in terms of the Strait of Hormuz and tolling and stuff like that. So that's why I think that it's not just going to be the signature of Washington itself, but actually that we're going to need to see a regional guarantee that makes it costly for any side to walk away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Benjamin Ashraf. And as we are about to close, Mr. Mohammed Krissasi, very briefly, if this agreement actually holds and we see this 60-day ceasefire extension, what are the immediate tangible impacts on global inflation, supply chains, and the fragile energy market? But very quickly, please.
Well, very quickly, I think, in my humble opinion, it will liberate the market, and we saw it today. For example, they didn't even sign anything, but the petrol, as I said, is $78. The flow, the supply chain will take more time because you have what you call the trade cycle, which is from Iran to go to part of Asia, or even Africa is going to be 2 or 3 months in the beginning. And I see from about 6 months from now, we are going to be back on the track. As long as I said, again and again, I will make the final statement. In my opinion, nothing has been finalized so far. You know, they postponed the agreement, but I hope that President Trump, you know, this war began with Israel, and I think it will end with Israel when Trump will say to Israel, stop what you're doing, let's go back to the peace in the Middle East, and let's hope, inshallah, as we said, that everything is going to be, by the end of this year, we're going to be fine. And again, thank you, Yvonne, for the metaphor. I'm an Algerian and I'm a fan of football, so you did the right metaphor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed Krissasi. Unfortunately, we have run out of time and we have to leave it there. My sincere thanks to all our guests for their invaluable insights tonight. Mr. Greg Pretty in Washington, Dr. Yvonne Ridley in Glasgow, Benjamin Ashraf in Vienna, and Mohammed Krissasi in New York. Thank you all for your insights, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on our channel. Until next time, have a good one.